On the 2nd of June, 1763, a band of Ojibwe and Saukes arrived upon the walls of Fort Michilimackinac in what is northern Michigan. They were unarmed and had come, they claimed, to commemorate the birthday of King George III with their ritual ball game of lacrosse. As the commander of one of the most isolated garrisons in the British Empire, Major Etherington was delighted for the entertainment. Placing money on an Ojibwe victory over the Saukes, he invited the 35 redcoats under his command to come out into the field to spectate, instructing them to come unarmed. The game commenced to much fanfare and applause until, suddenly, all hell broke loose. With a mighty swing of his lacrosse stick, a native warrior launched the ball over the stockade and into the fort. Suddenly, the women among them threw off their blankets to reveal hidden knives, tomahawks, and rifles. The warriors fell upon the redcoats outside the walls, killing them before rushing into the fort. This dramatic event unfolded at the height of Chief Pontiac's War, an important prequel to the creation of America and one of the most successful Native American rebellions in history.
This video is sponsored by you. Unfortunately, the YouTube environment is not great right now, with the algorithm being friendlier to drama and react channels and YouTube being permissive of AI slop. We don't do drama and we don't do AI, but thanks to our members and patrons, our channel continues to make 3 public videos per week, with the team intact and going strong. In recognition of their generosity and contributions, members and patrons receive 2 additional exclusive videos each week, and access many other perks. Join them to watch more than 250 exclusive videos covering every era of history. Join them by scanning the QR code on your screen, via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video.
By the mid-1700s, Britain's 13 colonies were well established on the eastern seaboard, while the French Empire laid claim to a massive 800,000 square kilometre territory, which stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the edge of the Arctic Circle. However, while the British colonial population numbered nearly 1 million, there were only around 60,000 French settlers within the entirety of Nouvelle France. Save for a handful of larger settlements like Quebec City and Montreal, these few francophones were dispersed throughout a network of remote fur trading outposts, built along waterways like the St. Lawrence, Ohio, and Wabash, and most of what is now the American Midwest remained sovereign indigenous territory, unknown and unsettled by white men. Unlike the 13 colonies of Britain, the French in North America relied on the goodwill of the local native nations to project any authority against their European rivals in the theatre. To that end, French traders and missionaries went to great lengths to learn the languages and customs of their Algonquian neighbours, providing tributary gifts to influential chieftains in order to cultivate alliances. Through their interactions with the French, the Algonquian nations grew accustomed to a method of interaction with Europeans in which their sovereignty and way of life were respected. This, however, would change when France was swept off the continent and the Anglos began to encroach westward. In 1754, the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in Europe saw indigenous nations take up the tomahawk alongside their respective French and British allies in North America, with the 6 nations of the Iroquois honouring their long-standing alliance with Britain, and Algonquian nations siding with their French fur-trading partners. There were far fewer French settlers in North America than British, forcing the French to rely on their native allies to level the playing field. At the Battle of Monongahela in the wild forests of Pennsylvania, a force of 640 French-aligned Odawas, Ojibwes, and Potawatomis fell upon a British column over twice their number, appearing like wraiths from the tree line and massacring their foe. Yet France's early successes soon waned. In 1759, British General James Wolfe martyred himself in the conquest of Quebec City, a fatal blow to French power in North America. Thereafter, the French formally capitulated, surrendering their vast New World empire to Britain. Per the international laws of Europe, all the lands around the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley once claimed by France now belonged to the British Crown. Yet, the vast length and breadth of these lands had never been settled by France, and the sovereign nations within them were not keen on bending the knee to King George. As British soldiers garrisoned the formerly French forts in the region, they were given a sober warning by the Ojibwe chieftain Minavavana. Although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. Much like their later American successors, the British Empire did not view Native Americans as sovereign peoples. After conquering France's North American colonies, Britain respected French-Canadian language and religion, but denied similar recognition to France's indigenous allies, who saw themselves as undefeated and expected the same respect the French had shown. Instead, British authorities treated them as a conquered population. Governor-General Lord Geoffrey Amherst ended the French custom of gift-giving to native leaders and expanded former trading posts into military strongholds, heightening unease. At the same time, waves of settlers from the 13 colonies pushed west despite limited official approval. Amid rising tensions, the Lenape prophet, Neolin, warned that English influence would bring disease and ruin. His message inspired the Odawa chief, Pontiac, who by 1762 led a growing anti-British alliance. In 1763, after war belts and tomahawks were sent across the Great Lakes and Mississippi regions, open rebellion began. With a population of over 4.3 million, the modern metropolitan area of Detroit is one of the largest urban sprawls in the American Midwest. But back in 1763, it was a humble wooden stockade, defended by a British garrison commanded by one Major Henry Gladwin, and consisting of 120 redcoats, a handful of irregular militias, and 2 small warships on the Detroit River. The continued existence of this remote frontier settlement was put to the test when it came under siege by a large native warband. When Pontiac's warriors appeared before the White Oak Palisades of Detroit on May the 9th, the Odawa chieftain hatched a plan to take the fort by infiltration. He and his warriors would enter unarmed to smoke the peace pipe with its commander, while their women concealed rifles with shortened barrels under blankets and snuck them into the compound, at which point they would fall like leopards upon the unsuspecting garrison. Unfortunately for Pontiac, his scheme was betrayed to Gladwin by a native woman, who, some legends claim, was in love with the British major. Pontiac set up camp at the mouth of a creek 2 miles to the north, while his warriors surrounded the palisades. Unaccustomed to siege warfare, the natives were unable to breach Detroit's walls. Yet, in the surrounding woodlands, they were apex predators, and found their prey in the British reinforcements making for the besieged fort. On May 28th, a contingent of Wyandots fell upon a company of the Queen's Rangers 40 miles east of Detroit at Point Pelée, on what is now the Canadian side of the border, massacring 60 of the 90 soldiers in the column. On July 29th, a force of 250 British regulars commanded by one Captain James Dalyell arrived to bolster Detroit's defences. Against Gladwin's advice, Dalyell decided to launch an offensive strike on Pontiac's camp. Dalyell marched north, aiming to ambush his enemy under the cover of darkness. Instead, he was surrounded by Algonquian braves that drowned the night sky with their whooping as they fell upon the redcoats from prepared entrenchments along the tree line. Dalyell was killed, and his column scattered and fled. Around this time, Pontiac attempted to negotiate a surrender out of Gladwin, ominously declaring that if the British commander refused and was captured, he would be treated as a native and ritually tortured to death in the native way. Gladwin dryly pointed out that his own king would execute him if he abandoned his post, so he intended to remain. Detroit ultimately held out, and Pontiac was eventually forced to break his siege. By then, however, the entire Old Northwest was aflame in rebellion. By the summer of 1763, the frontier lands of British America had been engulfed in a whirlwind of fervent indigenous fury. As Chief Pontiac and his warriors prosecuted their siege on Fort Detroit, his allies among the neighbouring nations fanned out and struck the nearest British outposts within their lands. The great British army that had conquered these lands from the French 3 years prior had dispersed, and what small garrisons remained in occupied Indian country were not even aware of the native uprising. On May 16th, a band of Wyandots infiltrated Fort Sandusky under a false banner of peace, massacring and scalping the 15 redcoats within and burning the structure to the ground. A week later, Fort St. Joseph fell to a band of Potawatomis in much the same manner. Fort Miami fell when its commander, Ensign Holmes, was lured out of its walls by his indigenous Miami mistress and shot dead by her kinsman. Fort Oweatanon fell to the Kickapoos, who invited its 20-man garrison out of its walls under a false pretense of a peace council, only to be surrounded and captured. The Kickapoos had been on good terms with the British, and apologized for seizing their fort, claiming they were obliged to do it by the other nations. At Fort Michilimackinac, a band of Ojibways and Saukes offered to stage a game of lacrosse in honor of King George III. The British garrison came out to watch, at which point a player launched a ball through the gates the redcoats had left open, a sign for his fellow warriors to rush in and seize the structure. By June, the Senecas had joined the fray. They were a part of the Iroquois Confederacy that had fought alongside the British against the French, yet had been mistreated by their English allies all the same. The Senecas took Fort Venango, possibly also by way of Lacrosse Bamboozle, as well as Fort Le Boeuf and Fort Presque Isle. The situation could only be described as a military disaster, with British authority west of the Appalachians having nearly collapsed. A generation before the rise of the United States, Pontiac's uprising sparked intense racial violence between settlers and indigenous peoples. As British forts fell, frontier regions of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland were ravaged by raids that burned farms and killed civilians, leaving thousands dead or displaced. The brutality was not one-sided. In retaliation, a group of Pennsylvanian colonists known as the Paxton Boys targeted nearby Mohican, Lenape, and Susquehannock communities, many of whom were Christian converts uninvolved in the rebellion. Their killings drew sharp condemnation from Benjamin Franklin, who argued that punishing all indigenous people for the actions of a few was unjust. With a population of over 2.4 million, the modern Pittsburgh MSA is one of the largest urban areas in the Rust Belt. Much like Detroit, however, its humble origins lay in a rugged frontier fortress that came under siege during Pontiac's War. On June 22nd, a warrior wave of Shawnees, Lenapes, Mingos, and Senecas appeared before the walls of Fort Pitt, to find it crowded with panicked refugees from the surrounding farmsteads coming to seek the safety of its walls. Most prominent among the native leaders was Gayasuta, a Seneca war chief who 10 years earlier had journeyed along the frontier with a young British officer named George Washington. Fort Pitt was a proper citadel, made of stone bastions covering all angles of attack and defended by a 230-man garrison led by the 22-year-old Swiss mercenary Simeon Uyghur. When the natives launched their first assault upon the walls, they were driven back by cannon fire. Around this time, evidence of smallpox was discovered within the fort's overcrowded refugee camp, giving Captain Uyghur an insidious idea. On the 24th, the Lenape chieftain Turtleheart parleyed with 2 British officers outside Pitt. "All the other forts have fallen," he warned them. "This is the only one you have left in our country." The officers cordially informed Turtleheart that they would hold out, and as a gesture of ostensible good faith, presented a tribute of smallpox-infested blankets taken from the fort's hospital. It's unknown how effective this attempt at biological warfare actually was, but it was nonetheless an indication of how the British considered the heathen Indians to lie outside the civilized conduct which governed war between European peoples. In the closing days of July, a 500-strong column of British soldiers, commanded by one Colonel Henry Bouquet, departed Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to march to the relief of Fort Pitt. When Gayasuta's scouts reported this, the Seneca chief broke the siege to intercept. The two forces met at a place called Bushy Run. Lenapes and Shawnees fell upon the redcoats in a fury, forcing them up a hill where they made a makeshift bunker out of flour sacks and hunkered down. The natives assaulted this position, but were driven back by a furious counterattack of the 42nd Highlanders. The kilted Scotsmen charged headlong into the painted warriors, putting them to flight. 1/5 of the British force had been killed, but Fort Pitt had been saved. By late 1763, the momentum of Pontiac's alliance was fading. Although many smaller British forts in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley had fallen, Fort Pitt and Fort Detroit held firm, turning the conflict into a draining war of attrition that weakened tribal unity. Hopes that French victories would draw France back into the war proved false, and it became clear that no aid was coming. One by one, nations began making separate peaces with Britain, beginning with the Senecas at the Treaty of Fort Niagara. In 1764, Colonel Henry Bouquet marched into the Ohio Valley with a strong force, persuading groups like the Shawnees and Lenapes to end hostilities rather than fight. Pontiac resisted longer, but in July 1766, he finally signed a formal peace treaty with the British at Fort Ontario, ending the rebellion. In many ways, Pontiac's rebellion was a strategic victory for the indigenous nations who had fought within it. The British had not been driven from their lands, but had been roughed up enough to take measures to appease the tribes to prevent any further trouble. To that end, the British restored the French practice of tributary gift-giving and placed restrictions on their colonial settlements west of the Allegheny Mountains, which was to be designated Indian territory. In fact, King George III had issued a Royal Proclamation back in 1763, demarcating just such a line before Pontiac's war had even begun. But the bloody Indian Rebellion had lit a fire under the British government's rump to start actively enforcing it. Through his rebellion, Pontiac had won the Native Americans a reprieve from colonial aggression, albeit only a temporary one. Indeed, the party most outraged by Britain's peace with the Indians was the Empire's colonial American subjects, who would eventually cite Britain's limitations on their westward expansion as one of the chief justifications for their own rebellion. A rebellion that would create a new nation, which posed a greater threat to native peoples than the British Empire ever had. More videos on the history of Indigenous America are on the way, so make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.